On Monday, an explosion tore through Ukraine's largest children's hospital situated in the heart of Kyiv. Its intensive care unit, cancer department and operating theatres were all damaged. Officials reporting that debris fell into heart patients' open chests during surgery. The missile strike on Okhmatdyt, in essence Ukraine's Great Ormond Street Hospital, was part of a broader Russian strike which killed more than 40 and injured hundreds across the country. As bodies were being pulled from the rubble, world leaders were preparing to meet at a NATO summit. An emergency session of the UN Security Council has been called. For his part, President Zelensky has reiterated his pleas for more air defence systems and for more weapons with which he can strike targets inside Russian territory. I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. Well, later on we are going to be speaking to Sky's defence editor about the international response to, just the latest bloody day in Ukraine. But we'll begin with someone who actually saw the immediate aftermath of the attack on the hospital. Jimmy Rushton is a Kyiv-based journalist and security analyst. Jimmy, you were there, half an hour after the strike took place. What did you see?
It was a scene of absolute chaos. There was thick smoke and there was dust and there was screaming children and parents and doctors evacuating clearly severely ill children from the hospital. Some of them still had IVs in their arms. Some of them were undergoing chemotherapy, treatment for cancer. Some of them had suffered hair loss and some of them were severely jaundiced. And rescue workers were already starting to pull through the rubble in order to attempt to find survivors. And this was during an ongoing air raid. And at times we had to run. We had to shelter because there were missiles being intercepted almost literally above our heads at the time. So
It sounds absolutely horrific, but you've been in Kyiv for quite some time now. You will have seen the aftermath of strikes like this before. I suppose, though, given this was a children's hospital, some incredibly sick kids were in there, that it must be even more shocking to see the injuries and indeed, the dead bodies being recovered from this place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're already going through a really, really difficult time in their lives. Imagine having cancer and you're 6, 7, 8 years old and you really don't understand what's happening to you and you're going through this incredibly invasive medical treatment. And then the hospital where you're going through chemotherapy is blown up by a cruise missile. I mean, it's almost unimaginably cruel. I saw a couple of rescue workers and a couple of journalists just breaking down because it was a horrific scene. It's the worst scene I've seen in Kyiv by a country mile.
Of course, it wasn't just the patients. It was the friends and families of those patients, the hospital staff, medical and everything else. I mean, where did they go, given that there was an ongoing air raid?
The hospital has a number of shelters. A lot of the patients had been taken down to the shelters, so they'd started to emerge from the shelters when I got there. The big fear was that Russia would do what is termed as a double tap, which is when they strike a location and then they immediately follow up that strike with another missile attack in order to kill first responders. So they were concentrating on evacuating as many of the severely injured children and just everyone that they could from the site. So there were a lot of ambulances that were turning up and there were kids that were being wheeled out of the hospital, still on hospital gurneys and still with IVs attached to them.
A number of people, yourself included, have described the hospital as Ukraine's Great Ormond Street. I mean, was this potentially a case of, a mistaken identity in terms of the target?
I would say it's very difficult to have mistaken this building for anything resembling military target because there aren't any military targets around it. Obviously there are military targets in Kyiv, but around this particular building, there aren't any. The other thing is, I think it's important to point out that the missile that struck this building, and there is clear video evidence of the missile strike in this building, was under powered controlled flight as it impacted. So it wasn't affected by Ukrainian air defense. It wasn't debris that had been shot down and kind of, just fell relatively randomly. No, this was a clear, deliberate attempt to hit this specific building, this specific hospital.
But of course, and indeed as you will have seen and I have seen on previous occasions, whilst the Russians were more than happy to claim responsibility for other attacks that took place, and we should remember that other attacks did take place during this strike, this particular incident, they're denying any responsibility for.
Well, it's an interesting reaction on Russian Telegram, which is the major social network in Russia. half of the Russian users that I've seen are celebrating this attack and saying, we should do more. We should hit the children sheltering in the courtyard directly after the strike. And the other half of them are saying, well, we didn't do it. It's this kind of dual-faced reaction that, we didn't do it, but hey, they deserve to be hit again and they deserve to suffer more. And it's incomprehensible why you would want to do this. Unless, of course, you're attempting to do what the Russians have said that they are going to try to do, which is to make Ukraine unlivable for Ukrainians, to pressure them into agreeing to Russian terms in the most kind of barbaric way possible.
Well, that is the response of those Russians who take to Telegram at times like this. I wonder, what was the response of those that you spoke to on the scene in the immediate aftermath?
Pure shock, really. The adults were obviously coping with it better than the children. Some of them were just crying hysterically. Some of them were just grabbing the legs and the arms of the parents and doctors. Some of them were just, completely silent, completely stupefied, really, by what had happened. It's incredibly difficult. As a journalist, you try and remain detached, but you do find yourself affected by this, especially when children are involved, because, as a journalist that works in a war zone, you do see quite a lot of death and destruction, and in some senses you come to get used to it. But with children, I think it's something different.
I suppose, though, those who are running this hospital will be gladdened at least that there has been some international assistance offered in their direction. Germany, others looking to perhaps deal with some of these children, the very, very sickest children in Ukraine, as you've so eloquently put.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely welcome, but obviously, when you have children that are this sick, just traveling is difficult for them. So the long journey out of Ukraine, the disruption in their treatment, it's obviously going to negatively affect their outcomes. A lot of these children had been evacuated from other areas of Ukraine. Some of them suffered burns in previous Russian attacks that were being treated here as, it's a major centre of clinical excellence to treat children in Ukraine, which has now been destroyed for the foreseeable future.
A day of mourning in honour of those who've lost their lives and of course, those who have been injured in this attack. But, Jimmy, you've been following this for quite some time. There have been some very dark days for Ukrainians since the Russians began this invasion. But I do wonder if there have been many that have been as dark as this.
That's a difficult one. To be honest, as I was walking on the streets of Kyiv today, I didn't really sense that much different. And that might be shocking, but to be honest with you, it's a country that has become accustomed to dark days, as you say. And I think there is very much a sense of we have to get on with it. We have to keep fighting. We have to fight the Russians. We have to make sure that they don't take more territory, that they don't launch more attacks on us, because, nobody is going to come to our aid. So there is that quiet determination, I think, in Ukraine that I see from most Ukrainians. I mean, if anything, I think this will have steeled their resolve. It will have reminded them why this enemy is an enemy that is worth fighting against, that is worth dying for in many cases. I think if Russia thinks that this will intimidate the Ukrainians, if they think that it will force them into cowering and backing down, he's absolutely mistaken.
Well, as already mentioned, Russia denied on Tuesday that it had attacked the children's hospital. Instead, they said that Ukrainian anti-missile fire was to blame for Monday's strike, but without providing any evidence to support that claim. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov repeated Moscow's insistence that it does not attack civilian targets in Ukraine. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, and we continue to focus on the attack on Ukraine's largest children's hospital and, of course, the international response to it. Deborah Haynes is our Defence and Security Editor. Deborah, you've actually been to this hospital, haven't you? And more than once, in fact.
Yes, I went to this hospital literally just a few days after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think it was on the 1st of March 2022. They were desperately trying to evacuate as many of these children as they could. Those that were not too sick had already gone. But of course, moving some of these children who are receiving chemotherapy, receiving all sorts of medication and are incredibly vulnerable and fragile is very, very dangerous. And so it was almost like a balancing act between, do you keep them in the war zone where they're at threat of missile attack, or do you try to move them? And the very act of moving them could also be threatening to their lives.
And I suppose then that we are seeing the difficulties in that calculation playing out, though, ultimately, whoever expects a children's hospital to be hit. I should say again, Russia says it was not them, this wasn't an intentional targeting, but clearly much of the international community disagrees. Italy going so far as to call it a war crime.
I've actually spoken just now to a doctor there who I met when I was there previously, and he was on the site when the attack happened. He described how the windows in his office just shattered, and he said that X-ray machines, ultrasound machines had been damaged, and they were desperately trying to get them to work again because they've got patients that need them. And he believes that the hospital was targeted directly. Obviously, it's impossible for me to say either way. Russia does have a bad track record of hitting accurately with its strikes, but clearly hitting civilian infrastructure has been a strategy to undermine the people, to fight, to undermine morale amongst the people, to make them feel defeated. And so are they also deliberately targeting a hospital like this? People inside Ukraine believe, yes, that could be possible.
NATO summit, of course, taking place in the United States and Washington specifically this week. Given the scale of the Russian attack and given who will be in attendance in Washington later this week, one has to assume that this was deliberately timed by the Russians.
Definitely. And in fact, military experts that I have been speaking to in the last few weeks were saying that they anticipated something would happen on the 8th of July, the eve of the NATO summit. Maybe an attack in Ukraine, or maybe some kind of hybrid covert attack against a NATO member state to try to test alliance unity, test their responses, test their ability to deter. But it seems as though there is no coincidence that Russia decided to strike in this barrage of missiles it used. We're obviously very much, rightly so, focused on the hospital, but there were strikes across the country and dozens of people were killed and injured, including at the hospital site.
I wonder then, from a Russian perspective, whether this strike might have actually been counterproductive, given that NATO is meeting, given that Zelensky and others in Ukraine have been calling for a bolstering of their air defences.
Yes, there's two arguments, isn't there? There's the argument that Russia showing that it's not backing down, that it's actually intensifying its war in Ukraine, that feeds into the fears of those who argue this is not a winnable war, and that actually the best outcome would be to pressure Ukraine to come to some kind of agreement, some kind of ceasefire arrangement, but an arrangement that obviously would be on Russia's terms rather than on Ukraine's terms. And that's absolutely something that President Zelensky has said that he will not do. And so on the flip side, there is, of course, the likelihood that this kind of attack should really harden resolve. And it will harden the resolve of those allies who are 100% determined to keep alongside Ukraine for as long as it takes. And inside Ukraine itself, people absolutely adamant that they will not be broken by Russia.
But surely, Deborah, given what we have seen in Kyiv, and as you pointed out elsewhere in Ukraine, by the conclusion of this NATO summit, Ukraine's air defences will surely have been bolstered.
They would have been bolstered anyway, because the countries, they come to these summits with their plans to announce stuff. That's what happens, isn't it? I think the problem is, though, that the war in Ukraine has exposed the fragility of the ability of the West to sustain a long-term, large-scale, high-intensity war like we're seeing in Ukraine. And so, yes, allies are cranking up their production lines, but it is way too slow at the moment. And that's the limiting factor here. The limiting factor is not the will to support Ukraine, it's the ability to support Ukraine with the weapons that it actually needs. It really reflects the waning influence of the historic Western allies that have really dominated the world for the last century, more centuries, and the rise of a new era, which, unless the West does actually get its act together and start actually being able to defend its values and credibly fight back against force being used to change borders, then we are moving into an incredibly dangerous era where just rhetoric alone and hand-wringing is not going to stop those countries like Russia, like China, from acting in the way that is in their best interests, and is clearly not in the interests of countries like Ukraine.
Well, just on that point, I suppose another way in which the world order is changing is that some of the key personalities, the leaders of those countries, will be soon be changing, or, as in the United Kingdom, have recently changed. Sir Keir Starmer, of course, our new Prime Minister, looking at what he has said about Ukraine, looking at what he has said about defence spending, and of course ahead of this NATO summit, I mean, where does he fall on that spectrum between those who offer full-throated support, arms, material, everything, to the other end of the spectrum, giving only lip service to it?
The UK is in an unusual position, given our recent history of looking pretty stable, given the election and the fact that he has this big majority and a mandate for the next 5 years. But from his public statements so far, he hasn't demonstrated a sense that he sees defending the world order, defending UK values with force, if necessary, as his burning top priority. He has said that the defence of the country, the defence of the people, national security is, of course, the first duty of his government. But the list of his, first things to do are to do with very much domestic, non-military issues. And he's going to be announcing a strategic defence review. But many say that that's not really what's needed. Everybody knows what the problems are in defence. The challenge is actually not just having the answers, but having the will and the strength and conviction to deliver. Labour has said that they're going to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, but not given a date for that. But even that is kind of meaningless unless you have a clear strategy as to what you want that money to spend. Like, people describe to me the defence budget as being like your house insurance or your life insurance. There's absolutely no point in having insurance for your house that doesn't cover all eventualities. And if you have it at a really basic level, then you might as well just not bother. And that's kind of what it's like with defence.
No doubt Ukraine's air defences will be bolstered as a result of what some have already identified as a war crime. But no such system is infallible. No protection from airstrike absolute. The search for survivors in the rubble that was once a hospital has now come to an end. The threat from the skies remains. Now, if you want to hear more from Deborah Haynes on Ukraine, she has done an excellent analysis for the Sky News website that I can recommend you read. You can find the link in the notes for this episode. But that's your lot for today. We'll see you again soon.